Welcome to everyone here in attendance. Thank you for coming to participate in this very important conversation about reproductive rights from Halachic, Jewish legal, and medical perspectives. Tonight's panel, titled My Body, Whose Decision, will focus on the topic of abortion from these various perspectives. As we all know, reproductive rights encompass a wide range of issues, including sexual education, contraception, prenatal testing, abortion, and access to safe labor and delivery options for women, just to name a few. This panel is responding to the recent wave of abortion bans and restrictions, which are adding to a crisis of reproductive rights for many people in this country. So thank you to all of you who are here for taking the time to listen to these experts, to think about these issues, and to ask the difficult questions. I want to remind all of us that the conversation we're having tonight is not abstract or merely academic. This is a conversation about real lives, about women's bodies and women's health, about how we construct our families, about our finances, and about our communities. We cannot let tonight go by without reflecting on the embodied dimension of that conversation. We also must normalize conversations about reproductive health. When these conversations are shrouded in shame and secrecy, women's health suffers, and women suffer. 1 in 4 women in the US will have an abortion by the age of 45. Jewish women included have abortions, use contraception, have C-sections, and need sexual education, which means that this topic is relevant to people in this room. So when we talk about reproductive rights tonight and in the many days to come, please remember to do so with sensitivity and awareness that these issues affect real people in our communities. So with that, I want to turn to our panelists.
I'd like to set the stage for further discussion by going over the basics of conception. Because sometimes it's said, well, life begins when the egg and sperm combine, which is true, but it's a lot more complicated than that and nuanced. And I hope that you'll take away some of the nuance of conception in looking at the other subjects that are brought up. So to go back to some biology, that conception starts when a woman's brain stimulates the ovaries to mature an egg. And as the egg is matured, the ovaries in turn produce hormones to prepare the uterus for implantation. The egg is released from the ovary. It needs to be picked up by the fallopian tube. After intercourse, the sperm need to swim up from the vagina, through the cervix, into the uterus, into the fallopian tube. The egg is fertilized in the fallopian tube. It starts growing and dividing and spends 2 or 3 days in the fallopian tube before traveling down into the uterus, where it spends another few days before implanting. About a week after implantation, there's a connection between the embryo and the woman's blood system, and pregnancy hormone gets into the blood system and continues to stimulate the ovaries, which therefore continue to make hormones to support the pregnancy. So there's a lot of steps involved. And if you have a couple that has relations at the right time of the month, the chances of conceiving are only 20%. And sometimes it's because the egg isn't a normal egg. Sometimes it's because it's not picked up by the tube. The fertilized egg may not get into the uterus. It may not implant, either because it's not a normal embryo or there may be something adverse with the lining. So there takes a lot in order for a pregnancy to occur. Once the pregnancy is established, it starts growing and dividing. And by 3 weeks after conception, a little sac can be seen on ultrasound. By 4.5 weeks after conception, a heartbeat can be seen on ultrasound. By 7 weeks after conception, one can see a little head, a body, arms that are moving, and legs. And after 7 weeks, the basic infrastructure of the embryo is established, And really the rest of the pregnancy is growth and putting in the finer structures. It's important to remember that a third of conceptions, or really a third of all pregnancies, because as I mentioned, not all conceptions implant, and in fact we know from in vitro fertilization that many, if not most embryos, actually never make it attached to the uterus. But of those that do, a third will result in miscarriage. And most of miscarriages occur by 7 weeks after conception. And this goes along with the fact that most of the infrastructure of the pregnancy is set down in these first 7 weeks. And so after 7 weeks, the risk of miscarriage drops to 5%. So after the pregnancy starts growing and dividing, in the second trimester, the uterus expands, and at about 24 weeks of gestation, that's when the fetus has a chance at being viable outside the womb. And at 24 weeks, most fetuses that are delivered will not survive, and few will be normal, but there's a chance, and in a good NICU. By 28 weeks of gestation, in a good NICU, most fetuses will survive and will be normal. So that 24 to 28 week period is very crucial. So it's important to look at the fetus when it's part of the mother and when it's outside the mother. Unfortunately, when there was a terrorist attack not long ago in Israel and a woman was shot in the abdomen at 30 weeks, the fetus, which was obviously a very desired pregnancy, was delivered, but unfortunately didn't survive. So there's not a guarantee, even under the best of care. With pregnancy, that there are also changes that occur in the woman's body. And some women can go through early pregnancy with very little symptoms. Other times, symptoms can be very strong. Each pregnancy is different. When thinking to terminate a pregnancy very early on, as I mentioned, a third of pregnancies will terminate on their own. So there's a balance between intervening and waiting to see what happens. In early terminations, there are two options. One is medical termination, where typically 2 medications are given. One is blocks progesterone, and the other induces contractions in the uterus. And this can be performed outside a hospital setting. There's also the surgical termination, which has a higher success rate, but needs to be done by a physician or someone else trained in the procedure. The risks of pregnancy termination in the first 9 weeks of pregnancy are small. The risk of mortality is really negligible, but unfortunately all procedures have risks. As pregnancy advances, the risks advance. And in the late end of the first trimester, medical termination becomes less successful, and the surgical termination is the preferred route. And this goes up to about 20 weeks of gestation. After that time, it's really an induction of labor, and you have that fine line between when the fetus can survive and when it may not. So there's a lot of factors to consider in pregnancy. And when I was asked to give this talk, I currently don't do pregnancy terminations, but I reflected on when I was a resident, and that there were instances where we would have someone come into the emergency room in septic shock because she had a non-viable pregnancy, but the institution where she was being cared for didn't perform abortions. And so she instead came in a life-threatening situation. On the other hand, we would see women who were very indifferent to their pregnancy and would come in repeatedly for terminations without giving thought for birth control. And not to get graphic, but a termination done after the first 9 weeks, you're seeing what we would call small parts. And that image stays with you. From a Jewish perspective, that when I was looking at a residency program to go into, I wasn't comfortable about performing abortions. And at Harvard, where I trained, it was known that you had to perform abortions. You couldn't get out of it. And I spoke with someone in my family who said that it's something I should consider doing, because to consider the women wanting to have it done, and also that I would learn skills that could enable me to save a life, which subsequently did happen. But she told me the story that when with one of her pregnancies before 1973, which was a very desired pregnancy, she miscarried. And she was upset, and her doctor said to her, well, don't be upset. I didn't like the way the pregnancy was going, and if you didn't miscarry, I was going to recommend to terminate the pregnancy. And she looked at him and said, but abortion is illegal. And he looked at her and said, Jewish doctor, Jewish hospital. And so we need to consider what was done before 73. And as a physician, who specializes in fertility, the subject of abortion is a difficult one, but I know of circumstances where it's life-saving, both with regard to the woman's physical health and the woman's emotional health.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear you talk about this from the perspective of someone who helps people, access their fertility. Just your perspective, I think, is a unique one. Thank you. So I want to throw out some numbers. Up to 72 hours, up to 40 days, up to 3 months, up to 7 months. All of those are numbers that come up in the halachic literature about abortion. Maybe up to 72 hours to take the morning after pill in a case of rape or incest. Maybe up to 40 days in such cases. Maybe up to 3 months, according to the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, in a case of a Down syndrome baby. Maybe up to 7 months by that same posek, that same decisor, when it comes to a Tay-Sachs baby. Now, these numbers indicate really significant things. Number one, they indicate that the Jewish conversation, no matter where you fall out about abortion, is not about rights. It's not actually about a person's right to choose, or even necessarily a baby's right to live. It is actually about duties. It's about responsibility. What do we owe a baby at 40 days, a fetus, an embryo, sorry? What do we owe a fetus, an embryo, at 3 months? What do we owe it when it's past second trimester? That makes us different from the pro-choice, pro-life debate that is happening all over the United States. We are not only in the realm of abortion, not about rights, because Judaism does not see ultimate rights or absolute rights of anyone over their own body, let alone something that might be something beyond their own body, but Judaism in general. Has anybody here read in the Aseret HaDibrot, in the Decalogue, every person has a right to life? No, that's not what you read. You read Lo Tirtzach. You have a duty not to kill, right? We are a duty-oriented religion, not a rights-oriented religion. The reason I think that's important is because in order to have a conversation from a halachic perspective, we need to be able to take a step back from the way we're seeing this discussed in the media, in statements, and actually look to our sources. The second thing that I want to say, there are other Gemaras that we're not going to talk about tonight, but like things that actually happen in real life that indicate that a fetus, an embryo, a fetus is a something. It is maybe a life, but not a life. So for example, the Gemara talks about a woman who smells something on Yom Kippur, a pregnant woman who smells something on Yom Kippur and wants it to the degree that perhaps she might have a miscarriage if she doesn't get it, right? You can explain the science of that. And she can eat on Yom Kippur. In fact, I'm sitting next to the doctor who had me drink on Yom Kippur with my first pregnancy. And I showed her a picture of her Yom Kippur baby, 8 years on. We have a Gemara in Erchin that cuts in the opposite direction. Not violate Yom Kippur to save a fetus because it seems like its life matters, but quite the opposite in sort of the grisly conversation about what would happen if a woman committed a capital crime and she was pregnant when it was time for her to get the death penalty. They would kill the fetus right along with her. So what happened to that right to life, or considering it a life? It's very confusing. It's very confounding. So I would also say we're not a religion that believes life starts at conception, right? We're just not. So those two things, rights versus duties, life starting at conception versus this fuzzy, what exactly is this embryo and fetus? Those are two things that really they really characterize the halachic discussion here. But instead of just doing negatives, we're not this, we're not that, I want to learn with you the Mishnah on which basically all of Hilchot abortion is based, okay? It's the Mishnah in Ohalot, which probably should be pronounced Ahilut, because it means tenting over something for the purposes of Tum'ah, but we call it Ohalot because we like tents, I guess. The Mishnah in Ohalot, chapter 7, it's short. Okay, Mishnah 6. Ha'isha shehi maksha leiled, a woman who's having trouble giving birth, meaning she's in danger during the birthing process. This is a little gruesome. Mechatchin et havlad b'me'eha, they cut the fetus up in her womb. Umotzi'in oto evarim evarim, and they take the baby out limb by limb. Why? Mipnei shechayeha kodmin lechayav, because her life takes precedence over the life of the fetus. But notice, sounds like the fetus has some life, but her life takes precedence over its life. Yatsa rubo, what if the majority of the body of the fetus, which is now a baby, came out of her body already? And by the way, the Gemara in Sanhedrin reads this not as Yatsa rubo, that most of it comes out, but Yatsa rosho, its head emerged, meaning it takes its first breath. Ein nog'in bo, don't touch that baby. And I'm saying baby, not fetus, on purpose. She'ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh, because we don't essentially kill one person for the sake of another. So before the baby's head, or in this version, most of its body emerged from its mother, it had chayim, it had some sort of life, right? Enough life certainly that you would violate Shabbos for it or Yom Kippur for it, right? But its life didn't take precedence over hers. But as soon as the child emerges, now we say it would be a problem. Its nefesh, right? Chayim and nefesh, maybe a little different, right? Its nefesh takes precedence. No, it doesn't take precedence. It's just we don't actively terminate one life for another. It's not even a matter of precedence. It's actually a matter of status quo, right? What do we notice about this Mishnah? We don't frame things in terms of rights. We frame it in terms of duties. We don't talk about life beginning at conception. There's clearly different stages. But what is affirmatively the way we are framing the issue in this Mishnah? I'm asking you, because you came out here, you want to say a few things. What's the way we are affirmatively framing this? What is this about? What is the issue of abortion about in this source? What do you say? Self-defense? Saving a life? What's inside versus what's outside. So here's what I'm going to start with. It's framed here as a sanctity of life conversation. It's sanctity of life when you don't perform the abortion, although here the baby is out, so let's be careful. But it's sanctity of life when you do perform the abortion. Whose life? In this Mishnah, what we have as our ur text for this conversation is we care about the life of the mother, and in terms of the life of the fetus, we're trying to figure out through all of our then Talmudic conversations in different places in the Gemara in Yoma, in the Gemara in Shabbos, and in the Gemara in Erchin, trying to figure out what is the status of the life of the baby. Clearly, it's something. There's no question it's something. You wouldn't have had a Mishnah that said if the mother's life is in danger, it's clearly implying that if the mother's life is not in danger, you can't, right? So this is really complicated. Sanctity of life is at the center of it all. And asking whose life is sacred enough that you would break Yom Kippur for it, whose life is sacred enough that you would break Shabbos for it, whose life is sacred enough that you would sadly have to terminate a pregnancy to save that life. That's our framing. Now, beyond that being our framing, I also want to add that what you see in the literature is a range. What is the Torah prohibition of feticide, of terminating a fetus? Well, depends who you ask. If you were to ask Rav Moshe Feinstein, working off of our earliest Rishonim, the earliest medieval commentators, he would say the prohibition is murder. It's ritzicha, it is murder. And the only way it is permitted is if literally the mother will lose her life. Just like the only way I can kill another person is if they are pursuing someone else to murder them. If I see someone, God forbid, walk in here now and they have a gun in their hand, I shoot them because they are a rodef, they are a pursuer. But short of that, forget it. Keep moving on the spectrum. There are those who say, and I believe the Chavot Yair, Rav Yair Backrack is one of these, who say that it's chavala. It is the isur, it is the prohibition, also biblical. It is the prohibition to essentially maim a person. Maybe it's the prohibition of maiming the mother. Maybe the fetus itself has some. It's a biblical prohibition. But people who come from that perspective may have a little more wiggle room in terms of what would permit abortions. Because certainly if I had to undergo a procedure that's going to give me a bruise, but it's to help my health ultimately, there could be a parallel, even though it's a sad thing to have to think about, if there is a danger to the mother's health, that chavala, that would not be chavala necessarily. Or perhaps the chavala is about the baby, and in that case, it applies regardless. Keep going on the spectrum, and you'll get to some people who say that it is about hashchatat zera. The same way we are not allowed to waste semen, and it would be forbidden halachically to ejaculate outside of the act of sex. Same thing, this is made of semen and other stuff too, but semen, right? So hashchatat zera. Now, what does it mean? Is that sounds pretty lenienter, right? Like, okay, so what happens on the let's imagine this. I'm watching my time. Let's imagine this as a seesaw, right? So as the intensity of the isur, of the prohibition, goes up, the possibility on the other side for termination goes down. And as the isur, the prohibition, goes down in severity, the possibilities, the allowances, the leniencies for termination go up. And the last, and this is the Tzitz Eliezer, and with this I'm sort of going to end. The last is, well, maybe it's not a biblical prohibition at all. Maybe it's a rabbinic prohibition, because I can't really figure out what the biblical prohibition would be, because you have verses in Shemot 21 that describe if a woman miscarries as a result of somebody hitting her in the belly, that's something you could pay money for instead of a person being put to death, right? It's just very confounding. It's just very confusing. And so I'll end with this. How is it possible, and this is a setup for you, Gail, how is it possible that the complexity that I just laid out, and it is quite a range from no biblical prohibition to murder, and it is quite a range from no allowance for abortion unless the woman's life is at stake, literally, to the Tzitz Eliezer Taysac's case, because a woman will see the suffering of her child and their death ultimately, God forbid. That's too much for a person to bear, and so that too is protecting the life of the mother up to 7 months. Look at that range. How do we actually talk about this in a way that doesn't just become, hey, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican? How do we keep the conversation as complex and as nuanced as it really should be without doing something that is really plaguing the Jewish community in America so much now? The idea that I have to fit my Jewishness into somebody's party platform. We need to figure that out, because otherwise pretty soon we're going to have the blue shuls and the red shuls. This is just another one of those examples, and Gail can take it further in terms of actually discussing where she sees that.
Thanks, Elana. I totally love setups that are perfect to get into the next conversation. But so I want to turn for the moment to talk about exactly that. But really, how do we advocate as Jewish organizations and individuals? How do we advocate for our ability to preserve halacha and practice halacha in the face of secular laws that really don't fit that halachic framework? So first I want to start with just talking a little bit about the fact that Jews have a very rich history of weighing in on secular law when it comes to freedom of religion. And we have, we weigh in when secular laws impose an obstacle to our ability to practice our religion. And decades ago, there was really kind of a uniform approach that Jewish groups took in front of the Supreme Court in seeking the broadest possible reading of the Constitution to protect religious freedoms. And Jewish groups weighed in frequently on behalf of all sorts of religious minorities, including Muslim groups, including on behalf of Jews. Many of you might remember the case of the Jewish man who wanted to wear his kippah in the military, or the case about the Native American tribe who wanted to smoke peyote, which is a banned substance under secular law, as part of their ritual practice. And Jews across the board, traditional secularist organizations, really weighed in to assert broad rights of freedom of religion under the Constitution on behalf of all religious minorities. But then the framework started to change when really Christian groups, the Christian minority groups, really started to use the freedom of religion laws, which had in the past been really asserted by minority groups, to assert their own freedoms of religion under changing cultural norms. And so there's just two cases that I want to touch on and discuss how that affected kind of Jewish advocacy. And the first is the Hobby Lobby case, where a Christian business, it's a Christian-owned business, argued that the Affordable Care Act, which mandated that employers provide insurance coverage for their employees that included contraceptives. This mandate under the Affordable Care Act violated their religious freedom because in their religious view, contraceptives are prohibited. And the court ultimately agreed that this was a violation of their free exercise of religion. The second case is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, where a Colorado baker asserted that Colorado's anti-discrimination laws violated his practice of his religion in requiring him to provide business services for a same-sex wedding. And the court, in that case, the Supreme Court did not actually ultimately decide that issue. They did find that the Colorado State Commission had treated a sincere religious belief with hostility and sent it back to Colorado to make a determination without the hostility. So, but in both cases, Jewish organizations weighed in, but this time they were very split. There were some groups that advocated on behalf of the Christian business and on behalf of the baker, arguing along traditional lines that we had always argued, that any assertion of a religious practice should be held up at, should not be questioned without government intervention. And these folks had a right to assert broad religious freedoms under the law. Others, however, argued under varying grounds that against the baker and against the Christian-owned business, on various legal grounds, but ultimately trying to argue that the government did have a broad right to enforce anti-discrimination laws. And why was there this split in this case? I think it's because we were pitting two necessary norms for our success as Jews in this country. One was, we need a broad right of freedom of religion in order to be successful in this country as a minority religion. But two, we also need broad protection under discrimination laws. And so you see advocacy going in two directions here, and you see organizations balancing various issues. But what's interesting to me with respect to abortion is that it's actually should be less complicated, right? You have, and I would argue, let me finish the sentence, that there's near consensus in halacha that at least there's some circumstances where everybody holds that an abortion is not only permitted but likely mandated. That might be the narrowest of circumstances that Elana was pointing to in terms of the Rodef. It might be a much more expansive view, but whatever it is, there really is agreement certainly across Jewish legal advocacy groups that what we need for our practice of halacha is the ability is a legal right to practice abortion in some circumstances. And so you would think that our role as Jewish advocates would become much more clear-cut. We should oppose restrictions on that legal right to abortion. Why? Because, and I say any restrictions, because the boundaries that halacha places on abortion, as we've heard, do not line up in any way to the restrictions that states often place on abortion. Halacha does not talk in terms of viability. That's not something we heard from the Mishnah. Halacha doesn't talk about a specific number of weeks. Halacha doesn't talk about whether your provider needs to be board certified. So none of those things match up with the boundaries that halacha places on abortion. So in this instance, it seems, when the only situation where there would be an imposition on our ability to freely practice our religion would be a complete ban, or certainly a very restricted ban that didn't match up with halacha. Okay, and actually Rabbi Jeremy Weider was out in our shul in Los Angeles over Shavuot, and he was talking on this topic, and he mentioned that he heard from one of the Tendlers that Rav Moshe, who actually, as we heard, holds a very, very narrow view of when abortion is permitted and or mandated, also felt that government involvement would not be a good thing for the Jewish community. So that is one framework for what advocacy would look like within the context of halacha. And then in 1990, the RCA passed a resolution which was something along those lines. And I actually want to read some of it in order to make sure that I get it exactly right. Okay, so this is the second part of the resolution where the RCA, 1, proclaims that neither the position of pro-life nor the position of pro-choice is acceptable to halacha. 2, precludes the endorsement of legislative measures which would impede the appropriate application of halacha. And 3, calls upon the total Jewish community to acknowledge that abortion is not an option except in extreme circumstances and in consultation with proper halachic authority. So we can discuss the specific language they use to express their resolution, but the concept that abortion is only permitted when halacha says that it's permitted, and as such, we should oppose any legislation that impedes our practice of halacha, that seems to me to be a reasonable position that a Jewish organization can take. But I want to point to a different path that, unfortunately, the Aguda chose a different tactic. They filed an advocacy brief in Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Now, if you recall, Roe, this is the case that followed Roe, where Roe found a constitutional right to abortion. Casey determined that that right was not unrestricted, and states could place limits on that right. And so the Aguda files, this is 1992, and they file an amicus brief to say, Roe was wrongly decided. There is no right in the Constitution for a woman to have an abortion, except when that woman seeks an abortion as an assertion of her religious freedom. So I kind of summarize this to say that, like, abortion should be banned unless she has a note from her rabbi. And so, which, and in recent times, the Aguda has really doubled down on this position. This was 1992, but now they're out there really supporting state restrictions like those you see in Alabama and Ohio. So this, to me, is an incredibly, for a variety of reasons, incredibly bad strategy. And I want to point to the RCA first before discussing why, because they've actually taken a shift from that 1990 resolution recently, and then I'll discuss it together with the Aguda. So recently, for those of you who might know, that New York passed the Reproductive Health Act, and it lifted restrictions on abortions in the state. And so the RCA put out a statement opposing the lifting of these restrictions, and in discussing their opposition, I want to make sure I get the words right, they moved away from their 1990 statement, which, remember, it said that abortion is only permitted when halacha says it's permitted. But here they talked about abortion as murder and even lamented the state of our society, quote, where killing babies is no longer construed as immoral, end quote. Okay, so putting aside all that's wrong with these statements, from other than the fact that they're bad strategy for advocacy on freedom of religion, it's really the only time that I can think of, and I'd love to hear from you if you've got other examples, but it's the only time I can think of that Jews have ever sought the government to impose restrictions on our ability to practice halacha and then carve out some exceptions for us. And to me, that's the ultimate in a losing strategy. We've always advocated the least restrictive state intervention for the broadest possible freedom of religion. But in this case, when you say that, when you advocate for state restrictions that don't match up with halacha, you're really asking for the state to act in a way that imposes a burden on our practice of religion. And then to seek, as a minority religion, you seek from the state, which by definition is made up of the majority, and as we see, our courts are now certainly more oriented toward a Christian majority, to then seek from a majority exceptions for your religious practice, I think that has to be a losing strategy. I think that really, as a minority religion, we really have to keep in mind a bigger picture. One where we have this broadest freedom of religion, but also the broadest protection from discrimination. And there's no need in my mind to compromise on either one of those things when it comes to abortion or advocacy around our abortion laws. We can advocate for freedom from state intervention while still aligning with our halachic views. And so I am confounded by the state of affairs that some Jewish organizations have tried to take on this topic. And really, that's where I was going to end. But thank you.
Okay. I think we'll start off, just as I'm looking over the questions, Asking the panelists if you have anything to add to each other's or comments.
Well, I actually have a question for Gail. Just wondering if you think that one of the reasons we're doing this, meaning we're speaking in the language of Americans as opposed to speaking in the language of religious minorities, is because we feel like Americans, and sort of a coming-of-age story, and or is this about coalition building and sort of a Judeo-Christian vision for America?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I would answer that I think it's both of those things. But what's confusing to me is that the Aguda took this position in 1992. Certainly their rhetoric and coalition, the concept of coalition building with our Christian peers was in its infancy at that point. So that's what really throws me off a little. I certainly think the shift in the RCA position has a lot to do with that. You know, whether perhaps there's a strategy there that the more we sound like our evangelical peers and our Christian right peers, the more effective we think we might be in court. And certainly a component of it has to be that we feel safer than ever. If we're asking the state to intervene and then yet carve something out for our religious practices, it has to be that we feel safer than we've ever felt before. I don't think we should feel that safe, which is confusing to me about why Jewish leadership might want to take that view. But there must be parts of that, yeah.
We received a lot of wonderful questions. I'm going to start with this one. How would you respond to claims by the disability rights community? Or I will phrase that even more broadly. How do we think about this conversation of reproductive rights within conversations about disability rights? That selective abortions based on non-life-threatening genetic abnormalities are ableists. Along that same vein, how do services like JScreen, which screen folks before marriage for genetic anomalies, relate to this conversation? Who would like to answer?
A number of years ago, I was giving a talk about genetics, and in Googling, I found an article from 1985, I believe it was, when the New York Times was criticizing the founder of Dor Yeshorim. And for those of you who aren't familiar, that there was a rabbi who had 10 children, 4 of whom died from Tay-Sachs. And that in our time, fortunately, that's not something that we see, but prior to the 1970s, when a test was developed for Tay-Sachs, it was not uncommon for Jews to have children with Tay-Sachs, which is a very cruel disease because the babies are born looking totally normal, and then over the course of about 2 to 3 years, because of an enzyme deficiency, they die. And once the test for Tay-Sachs was developed, then amniocentesis could be done. And if a woman was pregnant with a Tay-Sachs child, even Tzitza Eliezer would say it's okay to terminate the pregnancy. And the incidence of Tay-Sachs children in the Jewish community dropped. And then it was further developed that in the earlier days of genetic testing, where you could test to see if someone was a carrier. And in order to have Tay-Sachs, both the mother and father have to be a carrier for the disease. And so the rabbi got the idea that, well, before a shidduch is made, that young Hasidic Jews would be tested, and if they were, and it would be done anonymously, and if both were carriers of Tay-Sachs, you wouldn't do the shidduch. And it's a very clever idea, and because in this community, the terminating the pregnancy would not would be more controversial, and also it was something the couple would face with every pregnancy. And so the leader really in antenatal genetics was this Hasidic rabbi, but yet the New York Times was criticizing him for we wouldn't say racist then, but whatever the term was, for using these determinations in marriage. Well, to fast forward, nowadays, there are hundreds of genetic diseases that we can test for. And we have the technology now that if a couple marries and they're both carriers for Tay-Sachs, we can make embryos through in vitro fertilization, test the embryos, and then just put back the embryos that aren't affected with disease. So that has obviated a lot of cases where in the past amniocentesis would be done and termination. But there's still cases where it arises. And I think that it's a complex question, and again, it's something we don't want the state answering, but you have to look at both sides. I mean, that for those of us who have children with special needs in our lives, they add a lot to our life, but they also, it's a tremendous economic burden in some circumstances. And I personally don't feel it's a judgment that anyone can make for someone else, and people need to have the option. So that it's a very personal decision, and I have to say that have firsthand knowledge of situations where a couple has been in this situation, and very black hat rabbis have authorized them to terminate the pregnancy. So what the Aguda says and what's in practice, fortunately, are very different.
So I'm very sensitive to the question, also because I said something that I wish I hadn't said about 30 minutes ago, which is I said very legalistically, up to 3 months for a Down syndrome. So that's cold. And it's not just cold, it's wrong. Meaning, it doesn't matter if somebody is Down syndrome, they're a human. Meaning, one of the things that and there's nothing I can say now that's not going to sound apologetic except for this. The position that abortion is murder that Rav Moshe takes actually is a way of him saying, no matter how this baby comes out, this baby has Tzelem Elokim. And this, meaning that is actually, it's the flip side of the conversation. The flip side of the conversation is how significant it is for any human life to exist. Now, that said, I think you also have to divide, and you certainly see this division in the halachic literature, between people who are going to suffer, children who are going to suffer and eventually die, and children who are going to live with disabilities. There is a major, major, major distinction there. And those who would say that when children are going to suffer and die, an abortion is okay, or to a certain point, and really I'm basically talking about the Tzitz Eliezer, when it comes to children living with disabilities, it's a very, very, very different calculus. And when I say very different, I mean the starting point is completely different. Because recall, the whole way that this is framed in rabbinic law is the question of what it's going to do to the mother, or what it's going to do to the parent. There's an assumption that the child's life is sacrosanct no matter what. Then the question is, how is the parent going to suffer? Not be burdened, suffer as a result. And figuring out what the spectrum is between suffering and being burdened, right, is actually what Rav Lichtenstein would have called the difference between psak, where you say what the law is, and psika, of actually ruling in individual cases and understanding what it is that the family is going through or not going through, as the case may be.
Okay, so this is kind of a conglomeration of questions that I'm going to kind of put together here. Abortions happen because contraceptives fail, because prenatal testing reveals anomalies, because women are sexually assaulted or raped, because people lose their jobs or their spouses, because people don't have access to sex ed. What if we looked at abortion as connected to all of these issues? In other words, would there be more consensus in the halachic or legal discourse if we talked about abortion in the context of contraception or sexual education? how does the medical discourse look different if, or how has the medical community thought about these issues as related to the abortion conversation?
I mean, so I think this harkens back to something we were talking about earlier, where I asked Dr. Lobel, where, like, is there really any form of a abortion on demand culture? Like, from, you know, I imagine it to really be a difficult decision for most women, but there are certainly communities of women without access to education, without access to contraception, with real limited power over their own lives and situations, that really probably use abortion in a different way than other communities of women. But it is a tool that they need, given all those other things. And I'm not qualified to speak on this. I'd really be interested to hear from you. But I imagine that has to be taken into account.
Abortion is it's different things to different people, and but it is terminating a pregnancy, and I think that that there are women who undergo pregnancy terminations with a lot of angst, and even in situations where the pregnancy is life-threatening to them, and there are a lot of women that it's about them and not about the embryo or the fetus. And unfortunately, that a lot of people do take it very lightly. And, you know, as I do work
Susan,
with...
can I interrupt you for a
Yeah.
second? I'm curious why you say unfortunately.
Well, as a Jew, I mean, there's a nefesh. I mean, that you have, I spend a good part of my day helping people conceive and seeing, it's a great privilege to watch on ultrasound, first at 5 weeks to see a sac, and then at 6.5 weeks to see a heartbeat, and then at 9 weeks to see this little embryo moving. And no matter how many times I see it, it's wonderful every time. And for someone just to terminate that without any thought, I think is unfortunate.
Right, so I think what you're pointing out actually is that it depends on one's own attitude towards the pregnancy, right? You're in the business of making babies, which is a wonderful business to be, right? And for somebody who wants that pregnancy, that's a very exciting image on the screen. For somebody who doesn't want the pregnancy, that's not a very exciting image on the screen, right? So it's not unfortunate for them that they can have an abortion. It's actually a wonderful opportunity for them to have an abortion.
That's so interesting, because it goes back to actually the point that you made about the RCA in their 2019 statement, or even the Aguda in 1990 making their statements. I actually think that in those statements, if you want, like put politics aside for a minute, imagine that it's not coalition building. Imagine that it's not that we feel super American. Imagine that actually those organizations are afraid of a cavalier attitude towards the destruction of something that in Judaism is not necessarily a full-fledged, but is something, right? Meaning, I actually think that what you're describing, the idea of somebody saying, I have a pregnancy that I don't want, and it's not the result of rape or incest, and it's not the result of the fetus not being viable, it's a result of, well, I forgot to use birth control, right? That's actually something that those statements are actually trying to push against.
Yes, except I would distinguish between, whoops, I forgot to use birth control, and the many other reasons aside from rape and sexual assault and whatever else that might occur. In other words, just because you don't want a pregnancy doesn't mean you're cavalier about abortion, okay? So I think those are two in other words, there are high rates of failure with contraceptive use the longer you use it, right? So that's something that needs to be taken into account. You could be doing everything you need to be doing to prevent a pregnancy and still get pregnant. This one is, I've heard a lot of the dialogue tonight pertaining to mothers and women. how can we center our conversations, or how would the conversation look different if we talked about reproduction in a way that was inclusive of non-binary and trans men too, who have to go through different barriers than cis women to access reproductive care?
I mean, I'll just start with the fact that literature right now on transgender, people who are transgender in halakha, it's just so new. We're just at such a new place. So the idea of being able to have that conversation, we have a ways to go in terms of having that conversation, but whoever's asking that question, keep pushing with that question because it will get there. I actually thought the question was going to be something much like a much more obvious lacuna, which is, what about dads? Like, where's the conversation? And it's actually interesting to see that in the halachic literature, because the Mishnah in Ohalot is talking about the mother's life, often, and because of the fetus being part of the mother, so to speak, that's like the two of them are sort of the center. But at the same time, it's interesting to note which of the poskim, which of the decisors bring in other family members into the calculus of who might have an experience of suffering as a result of this child suffering. Both the child themselves, other family members, including parents, but not restricted to parents. That's also interesting. So I know it's a different, on the real substance of the question, I think we need to get there in terms of how we talk about transgendered people in halakha, and it's just getting started, as you know.
I mean, I would just concur that it's I think from the perspective of Jewish organizations advocating in secular law, I mean, that's still evolving as well, but to be able to talk about what we might want to advocate within the realm of halakha, given how new halakha is, I completely agree with you. So I think it's really evolving.
There are a lot of issues raised tonight that we didn't get to. And I hope when you go home and you talk about this with other people and you think about it, you come up with even more issues that we need to keep talking about in the Jewish community when it comes to reproductive health, rights, and justice. And I hope you'll join JOFA again for more conversations on this topic. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you all for coming out tonight, for participating, for sitting in the heat, and thank you to JOFA and Sixth Street Synagogue for hosting. Have a good night.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.